Hello everyone, it's Matzi. Welcome back to my final part of the modular houses tutorial. For this part, I'm looking at a lot of the problems I ran into when I was trying to figure out how to make modular structures work. One of the main issues is that Smile Game Builder has a number of ways in which objects can interact. There's a lot of complex rules when you try to layer them on top of one another. Now, in my tutorials, I actually talk a little bit about some of those problems. In this one, I'm going to look at some of the specific things I discovered while I was trying to get these houses to work and how I ended up deciding to move forward with the building of the house. A lot of what I'm about to go over references a document I created on my website, matzi.com, specifically focused on object rules, the placement, and player interaction. I'm not going to pull up the website or read through it. I will leave a link in the description below. However, during this part, I will be specifically looking at some of the examples of those interactions and how that affects both the player interaction and the user interaction as you build your walls and buildings. Also, there is terminology that's important to use when thinking about objects. In Smile Game Builder, there's really a difference between a basic object, that's an object with no event associated with it, and an event object. An event object means that when you either do a default templated event or go to advanced event, you can have some sort of scripted interaction with the player. Event objects behave differently than basic objects. In some ways, event objects almost act like the player, although there are still some differences even there. Many of the ways I got these structures to work was simply by figuring out how to get basic objects and event objects to play nicely together. I'll start first by looking at the walls. Each one of these walls is actually built in two pieces. So they all have a bottom part and a top part. But each one of these are set up slightly differently. This wall on the left is an ideal example of a two-piece wall. That's because this bottom piece has an elevation setting of 2, fully blocked, the player cannot walk through it. And this top part, which is a window, is also fully blocked. That means the player cannot walk through either underneath or above. These sort of basic object settings are actually quite easy to work with and make it so you can have things like windows on top and walls below and so on. However, if there were ever a reason you needed to have a wall on top that allowed underpass, which this one does, and you can even see it has an elevation setting of 3 because I want the top part here to block the player and the bottom 2 to let the player through. When you have this type of setting, the allow underpass affects the objects below. So even though this object below here won't let the player walk through it as it's set up now, if I put it on top, the player can walk through just fine. Finally, there's a third option, which is if you want to have objects on top without having to have a imported object that's set up at a certain height. You can also get by using advanced events. So the object on top here, you can see even just by the highlight, is actually an advanced event. When I click edit here, I made it into an event, and that caused it to interact differently with the wall below it. So this wall here is a basic object. It's set with elevation of 2. And one of the things about interactions between event object and a basic objects are the event object respect the elevation settings, as long as the elevation settings are fully blocked. That means any event object will be placed on top of that event object. So this is another way you could get the effect of 2 layered on top objects that prevent the player from walking through and still look like one solid wall. The interesting part about this is this also means you only have to have one type of object as long as the settings don't allow the player to walk underneath. This has one drawback, which is if you want to do it this way, you will either have to keep adding the objects and changing them to advanced events or copy and pasting this object over and over again to get it placed properly, which I think I showed a little bit of in part 3 of my tutorial. Let's see how these objects interact with the player. So here I am walking up to these different walls. This wall right here, fully blocked, works just fine. However, this wall, which has allow underpass above it, means that I can't actually stop the player from walking through. And finally, this wall over here on the right, this will actually work properly. There is a little bit of a problem, which is you can see that there's a different line between the two, and that's because I didn't design the bottom floor piece to be on top of other pieces of wall. So that is a consideration to make. If you ever want to use this style or this approach, you would have to make sure that the bottom layer perfectly aligns with the top layer in its artistic style. Let's move on from basic objects and look a little bit at how doorways could work. As I said in my original tutorial, I didn't bother with trying to make a fully modular door for part 1, and that was because of some complications I ran into when I tried to set it up. My original idea was, here is a basic doorway, here is a door. Theoretically, I could have different styles of doors. Now I can make this work. In fact, I'll show you how it works now. It just takes a little bit more work, and here's why. This has to become an advanced event. And that means if I want to put an object on top of it, I will have to use an object that has allow underpass. For this example, I actually did make an object that has allow underpass. Just like this one right here, this is how this will interact with the player. The great part is, because it's an advanced event, it will still prevent the player from walking through it. I want to show that real quick so we can understand how this might work. So here's the door that I used in the tutorial. It is one solid piece of object with the door included. I can open it and walk through just fine. Works exactly like it did in all the different parts of my tutorials. This is the one that's fully modular. The object on top is allow underpass. The door beneath is an advanced object. And the doorway is just an object with allow underpass. I cannot walk through it, which is great. And when I open the door, this should let me walk through just fine. This actually does work without having to do a lot of extra things to make it function properly. However, it does mean that this wall on top will have to have allow underpass, which basically means you can only use it for things like doorways. Finally, with this setup, the approach I showed earlier where you can put an object on top of other objects, it won't work here. And that's simply because none of these objects down here have fully blocked space or objects can be placed on top. Basically, this is just not going to work if you want to try and put an advanced object on top. The last thing we're going to look at is the interaction with the player and the different types of floor pieces and objects that we need to place to let the player walk both underneath and on top of these floors. First, we'll look at the simple thing, which is flooring and the player walking on top. I went over this in the first 3 parts, so I'm just going to brush on this really quick. If you have an object that has allow underpass, the player cannot walk on top of it without a specific setting that lets other objects be placed on top. This piece of flooring only has allow underpass and no objects can be placed on top. You can see at the bottom right of my screen, wood floor level 2 fall through test. When the player tries to walk on top of this, they'll fall right through. This floor has allow underpass and other objects can be placed on top. For demonstration purposes, I also put the fall through test next to it to show that even if you put one of these floors next to one you can walk on top of, the player will still fall through. Let's take a quick look in our playtest. Here we are with our stairs and our floor. This one I should fall right through, as I do. So I cannot walk on top. In this example here, I can walk on top of the first floor, but the minute I go to the next piece, I fall right through. This setup is where I started from as I tried to get 2-story structures to work. Up here on the right is my test area for how I can get objects to work and still let the player walk on top of and underneath. In this first setup, I have covered this flooring with the wood floor level 2 that allows the player to walk on top. And you can see here, this is the basic object. It has no events associated with it. I'll take a quick look. This object can still not go underneath because any object will show up on top of this flooring. This is an advanced event, same thing. I cannot place it underneath these floors. So we have to figure out how to let objects go underneath and still let the player walk on top. Let's try first using the fall through test. If I move this piece out of the way, I can go grab my wood floor level 2 fall through test. So if I put that wood floor level 2 fall through test in place, I can now put an object underneath. Now this is a basic object, has no events. Event objects should work as well, just fine. Let's see what happens when I try to get a player to walk underneath and on top of these objects. Based on our previous lessons learned from over on the left-hand side, we might know a little bit about what's going to happen, but why don't I show it so we can see together. Now we're ready to test our setup. The bookshelf on the right is an event object. The one on the left is a basic object. We know a little bit about how objects interact, so what we should assume is that we can't walk through this bookshelf on the right because it's an event object. And based upon what we saw with walls, we think we couldn't walk through this bookshelf on the left. But as it happens, I am properly blocked. This gets to some interesting aspects of how objects are placed and what their settings actually are. In my initial example with the brick walls, the elevation settings for allow underpass was one higher than the object underneath. In the case of this floor piece and the bookshelf, they are both exactly the same. That creates an interesting case where Smile Game Builder has to decide which object actually interacts with the player and which one doesn't. This has a lot to do with whichever object was placed first, and I'll show a couple of examples of that in a minute. Before we do that though, let's first look at what happens when the player tries to walk on top. So, player can walk over this object just fine. So this fall through test, I don't fall through because there's an object underneath that has elevation of 2 that prevents player interaction. But I cannot walk through this piece of flooring. That's because, as a rule, event objects cannot have players walk on top at all. There's no case that can be set up that allows the player to walk over another event object. So this limitation was actually one of the things I ran into when I first set up my house. And I found out that as I walked on the second floor, the player would suddenly stop. There is absolutely no way to get this player to walk on top of this object. For that reason, as you saw in part 3 of my tutorial, I didn't even bother making event objects on the first floor. I just put events on the second floor and found a workaround to get the player to interact with the object on either level. Let's go back and take a look at some of these interactions with objects and layering. As we saw in the demo, this bookshelf and this floor interacted differently than we expected it to. And this is largely to do with the placement order of the objects, as in which object was put onto the ground first. So we're going to set up an example with new objects both for the flooring and for the bookshelf, but what we're going to do is choose which one we add first for each layer. Get rid of these ones. We'll move this bookshelf back to where it was. And then let's set up our test. I'm going to go into the indoor settings and pick a bookshelf. And for the left side, I will add the bookshelf first. Then I'll go back to my brick house, get my fall through test, and put it on top. Now for the one on the right, I'll place the fall through test first, and then put the bookshelf underneath. Now we can see what happens based upon the placement order of these two objects. This bookshelf on the left was placed first, with the floor placed second. This bookshelf on the right was placed second, with the floor on top placed first. Let's see what happens. So I can walk through this one. I cannot walk through the first one. So object placement means whichever object was placed first has precedence over the other objects placed on top, provided that they both have the same elevation settings. This is a bit tricky, and this is one of the reasons I ran into problems when I was trying to build the house, because sometimes I'd place certain objects first, and then put the flooring on top and it would work. Other times the player would fall through and land on top of the bookshelf underneath. Thankfully, when you're building a house, usually you put objects on the first floor first. So this problem shouldn't arise too much unless you're trying to do some different types of editing and adding objects later. It is really important to consider this because if it's not done right, the player will definitely fall through onto the object underneath and create some weird interactions. A way to get around this problem could be to go and edit your settings on these objects and allow other objects to be placed on top. I don't want to do that with the default bookshelf, but I will bring up an example of one thing I used when I was doing doorways. So I have brick doorway level 1 topped. This has settings that have the allow object to be placed on top. That means I can actually just take this object and put it right underneath existing floors. You might think I could do something like wood floor level 1 on top, but that won't work. That's because wood floor level 1 has no elevation settings. Therefore, it can't be placed on top because it's not treated like an object that has player interaction. I also can't place on top of it a wood floor level 2 block because what will happen is it'll go up an extra level. It's like two objects placed on top of each other. But what I can do is I can have wood floor level 2. This is because by design, objects that have allow other objects to be placed on top cannot be placed on top of one another. So instead they just end up overlapping. That's why when I have this topped version down here, I can just place it directly underneath the floor and it works just fine. Thankfully for most of these placement issues, there aren't a lot of troubles as long as you follow along as we did in the tutorial. That's because many of these things are based upon how the objects are placed or just following some simple rules on whether you put a pass-through flooring on top of an object or a fully blocked flooring on top of an object. The very last thing I want to look at is events. I mentioned in part 3 of my tutorial how in order to get events to work properly on both floors, you need to kind of work around advanced events. There's still a way to get an event to work just fine on the first floor. But in order to do that, you do have to place something on top here that prevents the player from walking through that space. The easiest example I have is what I showed in the very beginning of this tutorial, which is the brick wall level 2, which has allow underpass. I can put this on top just fine, and that will prevent the player from walking through it. That's exactly why this has an elevation level of 3 for allow underpass, because that third block here will prevent the player from walking through it. If I wanted to have another object have an event interact with it, I can also put an event on top. As I showed briefly in part 3 of my tutorial, I create an event object that ignores elevation and checks a variable that I set in the common events. I'll check that now. I have a common event that sets player height, which is the player's current location in the 3D space. Player height of 1 means the player is on the ground. So I'm going to check for the player being on the ground. And then I'm going to add a message that says, "These are my books." This will allow the player to talk to the bookshelf on the first floor and have it interact as if that bookshelf was an event object. Finally, I do need to make sure that I uncheck collide with player, otherwise the player will not be able to walk through the space of this event. Then I move the event above the object I want to interact with the player. Here we are. The bookshelf on the left is an event object that I can interact with. These are not the books you're looking for. And on the right, this is a basic object, but I can still talk to it. These are my books. The player cannot walk through these bookshelves, and the interactions are as I expect them to be. If I go up to the second floor, this wall will prevent the player from walking through it and giving away the fact that there's an event underneath. And I can still walk through the space where the event exists that allows the bookshelf to work underneath. I also can hit the space bar. I'm going to tap it really loudly, and you can see that we're not actually getting any sort of interaction on the second floor. This concludes the final part of my modular structures tutorial. It has been a bit of a marathon. I did not expect originally to spend this much time doing a tutorial on modular objects, but what I found out was there's so many different little problems. I needed to spend some time with each of the building portions so that we could fully understand how we can make this work, even with the limitations that we might run into with the game engine. I will be releasing the objects that I created for this tutorial sometime this week. I haven't yet decided where I'm going to put them, but keep an eye out on my website, Mati.com, for more updates on where you can go to get a free version of these objects. I may at some point do something like allow for donations. That's not currently something I need to do, so I'm going to just release these for free with free licenses. Use it as you want, and hopefully do something cool that you can send me an example of so I can see how this might be used in the wild. Thanks again for following along with my tutorials. If you want more tutorials on Smile Game Builder, please check out Companion Wolf's website and his YouTube channel for many more examples of how you can use Smile Game Builder in many different ways. Thanks again for following along. I'm still building up my repertoire of videos. Like and subscribe if you like what I'm doing. Please send me a message. Ask me questions. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.